All right.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is really exciting. It's NITSL's first online program, and as we were just saying, it's probably our best attended program yet. And my name is Matt Garklobs. I'm the Electronic Resources Librarian at Pratt Institute. I'm speaking to you from Brooklyn. And I'm speaking to you today also as the program co-chair for NITSL. And I'll allow my colleagues from the NITSL board to introduce themselves as well.
Hi, I'm George Prager. Great that all of you could make it here. I'm the program co-chair along with Matt.
Hi, I'm the for the next 15 days of NITSL, and yes, I'm in my bedroom in Brooklyn.
Hi, I'm NRL Dembiniam. I'm the president-elect coming of July. I'm here in Manhattan in my bedroom as well.
Hi, I'm Alex Whalen. I am the reception co-chair here at NITSL.
I am Timothy Mendenhall. I'm also in my bedroom in Manhattan. And I'd like to acknowledge I didn't include the whole board as panelists. So there are several other board members who are not here visible today, but I'd just like to acknowledge all of them. Oh, someone is asking what NITSL stands for. It's New York Technical Services Librarians, but I think Matt might give a quick introduction to that shortly. And I just wanted to thank my employer, Columbia University, for letting us use their Zoom infrastructure for this, our first virtual meeting.
All right, so Celia, do you want to introduce yourself too, since you're the host?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry I was a few moments late. I was making sure that everything was already up and running, so everyone beat me to it. I'm currently the secretary of NITSL for the current term ending July 1st, 2020, and it's a great organization. I really enjoy being a member and serving as a board member. So it's great that so many of you are able to join us virtually as we try out this new format.
Yeah, as Ryan was saying, NITSL stands for the New York Technical Services Librarians. Our organization was established in 1923 and is one of the oldest regional groups associated with ALA and ALCTS. Our organization brings together librarians and information professionals with similar interests who discuss ideas and practices and contribute their energy and knowledge toward mutually beneficial activities. As such, NITSL would like to foreground our support for the Black Lives Matter movement and the ongoing and necessary struggle to build a more just and anti-racist future. Systematic injustice is a reality in this country, and we hope to foster spaces for dialogue that can contribute to the dismantling of those injustices. With that in mind, we'd like to introduce our speaker, Barbara Pfister, whose work explores how systems are developed with built-in biases. Barbara Pfister is a writer and professor emerita at Gustavus Adolphus College in St. Peter, Minnesota. At Gustavus, she coordinated the library's instruction program, implemented a digital scholarship program, and participated in collection development, reference services, and shared management of the library. She was a 2019 Scholar in Residence with Project Information Literacy and is currently working on a book about the salience of library values in the age of algorithms. Her talk today is entitled The Bigot in the Machine, Bias in Algorithmic Systems. And before I hand it off to Barbara, we just wanted to make an announcement about a few logistical components of the program. So Barbara will talk for about an hour, share her slides and speak. And then following that, we'll have a Q&A session. And for that format, we would recommend submitting your questions using the Q&A module that's on the docket at the bottom. There's also, you can type in your messages and chat, that's fine. But for the Q&A component, it's best to use the Q&A module. And if people prefer to speak, if that's a necessity, you can also raise your hand. There's a feature for that, and we can select you and you can actually verbalize your question to Barbara. But as I mentioned before, just for flow and simplicity's sake, it's better to use the Q&A module. So without further ado, I will hand it off to Barbara.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me to speak, and to all of those who managed to find time to attend. I appreciate it. I know these are very interesting times, much too interesting, really. So it's taking time to pause and think about this stuff, I think I appreciate it. And I appreciate all the work that NITSL went into to set this program up and do it all online. Really, really appreciate that. So what I want to talk about today is this, what it means to have algorithmic systems that incorporate so much bias into them, and what we could do, we as librarians might be able to do about that. Just ways to work with our communities to become aware and to become actively seeking solutions for the problems that these systems create for us. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my slides so that you don't have to just look at me the whole time. And I hope this will work. Okay. So are you all able to see slides at this point?
We're still not seeing your slides, Barbara.
Okay. Oh, sure. See, it's a bit intimidating dealing with technical people because they know so much more than I do about everything technical. But let me try that.
Yes, great. We can see them now.
Okay, very good. Let's go ahead and do this full screen. Yeah, there we go. Okay. And I think if I can, I might go ahead and stop showing myself. How's that? Okay. Yeah, being an introvert, I thought it would be better to look at my slides. What I wanted to do today is talk a little bit about what we mean by when we say the age of algorithms, and about how bias creeps into and, or is purposefully designed into algorithmic systems. I'll be using some examples from public health surveillance and law enforcement. We're going to talk about how racists exploit the affordances of these systems to pollute our information environment. And then finally, because I really want to be hopeful about things, I want to talk a little bit about what we can do to address the bigot in the machine, and especially what we can do as librarians. So I thought, though, it makes sense to start by thinking about how bias is inescapably part of any attempt to organize information. A few years ago, a colleague and I convened conversations with faculty at our college to tease out what they thought were threshold concepts for information literacy. This was before that whole idea of thinking about these major concepts became part of redesigning the standards and creating the framework for information literacy that many of you may be familiar with. But we had read some of the same sources, and we thought it would be really interesting to find out from our faculty what they see as students cross thresholds into understanding things about information. And one statement that I especially remember was a philosophy professor saying this: information has to be organized, and how it is organized matters. There's acknowledgement here. There isn't any natural hierarchy or universal system of knowledge. As librarians, organizing information is what we do or claim to do, but we are aware of how complex it is to name things and put things into categories without somehow shaping and defining how people experience that information. Though we have in the past sometimes thought, yeah, it can be organized and it's a certain way. This is a vintage poster that shows how it was perceived as in the past. As language shift, we shift our subject headings, trying to fix the language so it's more accurate or less offensive. Though we may think of this as simply correcting mistakes, it's political work. We were reminded just how political it can be when not too long ago, Congress instructed its library, the one that so many of us count on to help us negotiate a common controlled vocabulary, instructed the library not to fix the subject heading illegal immigrants. The bill used to halt that repair work had the popular title Stopping Partisan Policy at the Library of Congress Act. And its Republican sponsor claimed this act would not only stop left-wing radicals from masking the complete and utter threat posed by immigrants, it would save taxpayer money, because apparently changing a subject heading is really, really expensive. Ironically, Tina Gross, who is one of the librarians who championed a change in that subject heading, has unfortunately saved a lot more taxpayer money, because she was one of 3 tenured librarians at St. Cloud State University who were just this past year retrenched, which is another interestingly political word choice, which really means fired. I should add, she wasn't fired because of her work on subject heading changes, but it was a result of politically motivated defunding of public higher education, and particularly picking on the library as an expendable part of the institution. As Matt Reidsma has pointed out, the challenges that we face around naming and categorizing things is extended into discovery systems, which are trying to appear as easy, as simple, as transparent as Google at surfacing relevant and useful information. Years ago, he created, I love this, this design for the perfect library. He was trying to express this is the way that students would like to experience the library discovery system. But of course, it doesn't work that way. Without Google's deep pockets for engineering talent and deep stores of data about who is searching for what, with our discovery systems, we end up with this sort of disembodied black box appearance of search results and recommendations, which can be difficult for us to influence or to explain. So we get the bias of the algorithms that we can't quite understand how they get to surface the things they do, but we lose the transparency that we've had with subject heading lists and classification systems as tools that we can use to examine and discuss those biases. Emily Drabinski wrote an article called Queering the Catalog, which many of you may be familiar with. She pointed out we can't really fix subject headings because language isn't fixed, it's fluid, and we can't align it with what the library user wants because there is no singular library user. So she suggests instead we approach all of this categorizing and naming of things from a critical perspective and use the library's imperfect systems as an opportunity to help students interrogate all information systems. We want them to recognize that systems that seem automatic and universal are actually created by human beings, flawed human beings in a particular time and context. So biases in them are inevitable and can be revealed and can be contested. Increasingly, I'd argue we need to turn that learning opportunity toward understanding and critiquing the algorithmic systems that so dominate our age. So that was a concern that shaped a project that I was involved in last year when I was invited to work with Allison Head and Margie McMillan on a report for Project Information Literacy. We decided it was time to inquire into how much college students and the faculty who teach them understand about how algorithms affect the information they seek and that they just encounter as they go about their day, and whether they had any concerns. So in the introduction to that study, we described what we called for shorthand, the age of algorithms. Nice alliteration there, we liked it for that reason. But it's really a lot of things. It's a combination of factors that shape our current information environment. So I'm going to outline those things briefly and use a graphic that was designed by Jessica Yurkovsky, who was part of this project, which is, by the way, available for use at the Project Information Literacy website if you find it interesting and useful. So among the things that we consider aspects of the age of algorithms, one is we shed data constantly because we carry computers in our pockets that collect and share information about our daily lives, including where we go, who we associate with, what questions we ask. And it's not just our phones. Data is also being collected from cars and household gadgets and health monitors. Meanwhile, advances in computation mean that data can be gathered, combined, and processed in real time. Being able to quickly manipulate enormous amounts of fine-grained, exhaustive data collected from multiple sources is new, and it's big. And while engineers have this capability now, we haven't come to terms with it as a society, what we want to do with it and what it's going to mean. Disaggregation and redistribution of information from what used to be distinct sources, like a local newspaper or a particular journal. Now these things are being distributed through other channels, and that makes evaluation of sources more difficult, even as results are personalized using assumptions that we can't really influence. So we don't all see the same information when we search, and it's not obvious where it came from. Automated decision-making systems are being applied to social institutions and processes that are being used to determine all kinds of things that, like who gets a job, who gets access to social services. So the bias that is already present is being hidden inside of a shiny black box, which makes it harder to confront. Artificial intelligence is trained using incomplete and often biased data sets, which means it can learn and amplify bias. This training is aimed at predicting the future, but is based on records of the past. We've entered this new phase of late capitalism, the rise of the attention economy, or surveillance capitalism is another way to put it. It's a profitable industry that uses vast amounts of data exhaust, that information that just follows us around as we use the internet, as we use our devices. And they use that to personalize, predict, and to drive behavior. Because capitalism assumes human activity centered on buying and selling, political persuasion is now part of that process. It's entered a whole new and very dangerous realm. The corporations behind this activity have deep roots in Silicon Valley culture, which combines a reverence for wealth with a naive belief in techno-solutionism that addresses unintended consequences with not much more than a public oops and a promise of tweaking the algorithm to fix it. And in the background, these companies, which are among the most profitable in the entire world, spend millions to lobby politicians to ensure they retain their power, but have as little responsibility as possible. And then finally, decades of media consolidation, deregulation, neoliberal economic policies, and the rise of a powerful right-wing media sphere have combined with the rise of social media platforms that are designed for persuasion, but have no ethical duty of care. And all of that is combined to engineer a certain amount of distrust of established knowledge traditions, such as science and journalism and scholarship. We live in a highly destabilized knowledge environment where the idea of truth is a matter of politically aligned consumer choice. In our focus groups with undergraduates, we found that students were actually very aware of the ways that Google, YouTube, and Facebook collect information because they could see it happening in the behavior of ads that were in this creepy way following them around the internet across devices and platforms. They were also aware of how what they saw on social media was influenced by algorithms that were purposefully amplifying personalized, emotion-engaging messages for profit. Most of them were really indignant about their loss of privacy, but they felt powerless because they just saw no way to opt out, and they saw no way to approach these powerful companies for change, to make them change. So what they knew about defending their privacy, they'd learned from one another, not from their teachers, but from each other. And even while we held these focus groups, some of the students were taking notes on what the other students were saying about, the ways that they protected their privacy. So they seemed really, really engaged and really interested in learning more about defensive practices. But these are all individual steps. They did not feel empowered at all to do anything collectively because they basically thought there was nothing that could be done. So as part of our focus groups script, we went on to ask about the ways that algorithms were being used to evaluate college applicants, get a job or a loan, or even determine the length of a criminal sentence. And most of the students were not familiar with these practices at all, and they were really bothered by it when they learned about it. As one student put it, this is just a fancy technology-enabled form of stereotyping and discrimination, which is inherently problematic, but it's easier for us to overlook because it's happening online and we're not seeing it. Some students did bring up some of the reports about bias that in algorithmic systems that we've been seeing in the popular press. For example, washroom faucets that are essentially whites only because they can't recognize dark skin. Or Google algorithms mistakenly labeling images of Black men as gorillas. Or algorithms that place ads that seem to suggest you ought to do a criminal background check on people when you've done a search of the name that the algorithm has decided is probably an African-American name. Though they had a wide range of awareness, many of the students were not aware of any of this stuff at all. They all were really deeply interested, and our conversations left them energized and hungry to learn more, which I think is a great sign and shows that there's an opportunity here that we can seize. If we see ourselves as information professionals serving communities for the public good, this is clearly an area where there's an opening for learning together. So how exactly does bias enter into algorithms when engineers don't intend it? As in these Google results that I came up with just a couple of days ago. It's there, and they're not necessarily aware of how on earth this could happen. Nobody designing faucets was actually trying to reenact Jim Crow laws to segregate bathrooms, and Google didn't mean to insult Black people by calling them apes. They were actually deeply disturbed by it. But the big tech industry is dominated by people who simply don't think about racism. They're focused on technical issues and creating new products quickly. They care about market share and growth and raising capital. And while they make claims about how much their products improve the world, they actually don't know very much about the world or the problems that they claim to be solving. They tend to base their assumptions on ideas of human behavior in individualistic, market-based terms. They work in an environment that's hostile to people who care about racism and sexism very often. And too often, their ignorance, their deep ignorance about people unlike them is matched by their overconfidence. Ignorance is no excuse, and there are promising signs that tech workers are becoming aware even as their employers appear to find that awareness threatening. Let's look at one example of how good intentions can go bad. This article came out last October, and it's about a provider of healthcare decision-making software that's used to manage care for some 200 million people each year. They wanted to create an algorithm that would flag patients who were likely in need of follow-up care. That's a good thing. But one set of data that they used to determine need was how much money had been spent in the past on their care. The assumption was everyone had equal access to healthcare. Yeah, nope, that doesn't happen, not in the United States. Using this algorithm, less than 20% of the patients it predicted should have follow-up care were Black. But when researchers examined the underlying data, they found that percentage should be closer to 50%. The algorithm failed millions of patients. This was discovered by independent researchers, and when they raised the issue, how did you get this? What are you people doing? The company worked with them to find different, more accurate data to use in their predictive model. But since these systems are proprietary typically, so it's rare for anyone to be able to reverse engineer the underlying assumptions. This isn't to say that algorithms are necessarily more biased than human decision makers. We know there's a lot of bias in healthcare decision making. But what it means, though, is an honest mistake, an unintended mistake, can affect millions of people. And the reasons for its mistake are hidden behind an appearance of objectivity, of scientific precision. An awful lot of money goes into outsourcing the work of making decisions to technology companies, of making what were human acts into data-driven and automated processes. Currently, there's just not a lot of accountability for those decisions, and not a lot of risk for the companies themselves when they make mistakes. Right now, during the most deadly pandemic of the century, we've been seeing a lot of discussion of using technology to manage risk right now. That might take the form of universities hiring companies that conduct invasive exam proctoring for students, spying into their own homes, or employers keeping watch over their workers at their homes in extremely intrusive ways, or companies using facial recognition and location and health tracking apps to check for social distancing, mask wearing, or to check on people's health conditions. Hospitals have been using AI to predict which COVID patients need the most care, or in extreme situations, which patients were least likely to benefit from care in a triage situation, without having any way of knowing if these algorithms actually work. These technologies are being rolled out very quickly. They're trained on historical data sets in a world that's dealing with a completely new and unpredictable disease. And as we've learned from our experiences after 9/11, once surveillance is used to solve one crisis, it's really difficult to uproot. A good example of how a bigot might unintentionally saunter into the machine is in automating the work of contact tracing. And all that data, this should be a no-brainer. All that data is already available, right? We know where everyone is and we know who they're near. All we need to do is write a little code to organize that information so everyone who has come in contact with an infected person is informed and is sent a little notification about how to stop the spread. But of course, it's not that simple. First, there's interoperability problems. Most phones run on one of two incompatible systems, Apple's iOS and Google's Android. But don't worry, those two companies are willing to work together. But there's another problem. People have become alarmed about invasive surveillance from these companies. A convincing argument can be made, should be made, I think, that privacy during a public health emergency should not be viewed as an absolute right, that with proper safeguards, communitarian concern for everyone's collective welfare in a pandemic takes priority over individual privacy. However, distrust of technology and of government and of science is now so deeply embedded in American society. A survey from the Washington Post last April found that 3 out of 5 Americans would either be unable or unwilling to use such an app. And that would make it ineffective if less than half of the people were using it. The damage wrought by tech companies cavalierly seizing our data, aided by lax regulation and deliberately confusing click-through contracts, is coming home to roost. Given a choice, a significant portion of the public rejects automated public health surveillance, even if it might save lives. And then there's other problems with rolling out an app like this to automate the work of contact tracing. Things that technologists probably would overlook, just not be aware of them. As Kathy O'Neill has pointed out, the people who are most at risk are least likely to have smartphones or healthcare or financial support or even a place to go if they find out they're infected. And as Julia Angwin has argued, the app design that Google and Apple seem to be working on would emphasize personal choice using proximity marketing tools like Bluetooth and beacons in a way that would make it vulnerable to trolls and spoofers. Given how political pandemic response has become, an app like this could be easily vandalized, and that would just make everything worse. Apart from these challenges, there's something more significantly wrong with assuming that smartphone technology can largely replace traditional contact tracing. The job isn't just about locating people and their contacts, it's about relationships. It's about taking the time to build trust and help people come to terms with a frightening situation. Contact tracers have to be able to find out what needs people have and be able to organize support for a wide variety of life situations. This is human work. Tech companies can figure out who some of us have come in contact with, but they can't do the rest of the job. The temptation to outsource labor to algorithms rather than count on public health professionals to organize work they know how to do is just another way to overlook systemic racism and its effects. Like every other technology, contact tracing apps are more about politics and about social structures than they are about code. So I want to turn to another technology-related topic that's on our minds right now. And a natural segue to this switch is a comment that my governor, Governor of Minnesota, made about how law enforcement officials were using local, state, and federal resources to contact trace people arrested in the uprising after George Floyd was murdered by police. When I heard that line from my Democratic governor, who I generally like rather well, my jaw dropped. I know tracing connections among people has been a common strategy in law enforcement, and that strategy has been ramped up a great deal with technology, but I've never heard that particular phrase used to describe what they do, this phrase associated with disease containment. It's a statement about our priorities that we can't seem to coordinate nationally or fund contact tracers that we need during a pandemic, but we can allow police operations to consume a huge portion of city budgets and coordinate with state and federal intelligence agencies without much difficulty. So, how do artificial intelligence, machine learning, and algorithms amplify racism in policing? Well, first, let's back up and acknowledge that racism is a persistent problem in all aspects of what we euphemistically call criminal justice. Police departments were established in the mid-19th century to control urban populations and defend the interests of the propertied class. In the South, it was slave patrols that provided the template for the development of police organizations. Protecting property and controlling the propertyless has always been a focus of the job, which has become more militaristic in recent decades. It's kind of interesting to see how this militarization parallels technologization, is that a word, with the police, starting in the 1960s. The first SWAT teams were created in the 60s, specifically to bring military tactics to the handling of riots that erupted in response to racism, which were riots often sparked by acts of police brutality. In the 1990s, the military began a program to pass its surplus materiel to local police departments. And then since 9/11, police departments have had access to even more military equipment, as well as intelligence agency technologies. The military equipment police use underscores the impression their job is not to serve and to protect, but to control and subdue the populace in ways that affect every aspect of Black lives. It's worth noting a 2017 study that found that police departments that participated in this transfer of military equipment were more likely than those that had not to kill people. And we know that Blacks are more likely than whites to be at risk of being killed by police. And those killings and other police violence have an enormous ripple effect on the health and well-being of entire Black communities. So this militarization of police was happening at the same time as technology was becoming part of policing. In the late 1960s, Lyndon Johnson hired a technology company created by an MIT political scientist. He knew about this company's work because they had actually worked on the Kennedy campaign in 1960, using computers to develop predictive programs to fine-tune political messages for that campaign. And so with that background, Johnson thought they could help develop predictive programs to identify trends and identify the leaders of activity in the neighborhoods where riots had occurred. That was the start of automating police surveillance capabilities, which ramped up, of course, enormously after 9/11. Now there are 80 fusion centers around the country, which bring local police, federal agencies, the military, and private industry players together to try and share information. And all of it's in great secrecy. This kind of cross-agency secret surveillance was outlawed after Watergate. It never actually really went away, but it was outlawed. The response to the 9/11 attacks actually made it official policy, and billions of dollars went into creating this network, which has come up with some truly bizarre ideas, such as a Texas fusion center warning other law enforcement that Muslim civil liberty groups and peace activists and hip hop bands were all conspiring to impose Sharia law. And another fusion center in Virginia instructed law enforcement to be alert to universities, especially HBCUs, because they were nodes of radicalization. Note the racism inherent in these alerts. The role that technology companies play in bigoted policing practices has become mind-bogglingly massive and profitable. The war on terror has given way to the war on immigrants, with all kinds of sophisticated technologies being deployed in the name of national security. I was shocked and kind of dubious when someone tweeted that a Predator drone had been deployed from its routine flight path along the Canadian border, that terribly dangerous border between Canada and Minnesota, was diverted to the Twin Cities during the protests there. That just sounded crazy. A Predator drone, really? So I went into fact-checking mode, wanting to avoid getting sucked into the tinfoil hat territory. But no, it was real. The state had asked for a Predator drone to provide aerial surveillance of the city and communicate with police on the ground in real time. These drones and other military aircraft have moved from the battlefield to the 100-mile zone within our borders, which they consider controlling our borders, and now they're surveilling our cities. Police have been using all kinds of digital surveillance technology, including license plate recognition systems, facial recognition software, predictive policing software, algorithmic software that purport to tell them where crime might happen and who might commit crimes in the future, and cell tower simulators, which gather cell phone identifiers and associated data from the phones, all the phones in the vicinity. All of this tech is developed by private companies with proprietary software that cannot be examined. In the case of cell phone simulators, the technology is so secret, the FBI insists that local law enforcement that wants to use it sign a non-disclosure agreement. And they've even yanked prosecutions if the process of prosecuting a case against someone relies on information from one of these instruments because it might reveal their existence. So rather, drop the case altogether than have that secrecy unveiled to the public, which paid for it. There's evidence that Minneapolis police used Clearview AI, which you might have been reading about. This is the company that scraped billions of photos from social media against the terms of service and has staff that has ties to neo-Nazis and white nationalists. So basically, all of these policing products mean that police can spy on us and pay private companies to do things that would be unconstitutional for the police to do themselves. Additionally, when given the pools of information collected about us to sell ads, those can also be used by police to find out who was where. For example, this is something I actually did not know until I was reading about what to be aware of during the protests. Digital display ads on bus stops in Minneapolis collect information about everyone who's standing near that bus stop. And these are on buses, these are on taxis, these are all over the place collecting data. Altogether, the surveillance capacity of local law enforcement in partnership with the state and federal agencies is frighteningly vast. And the cost of all of those technologies is part of why police budgets consume so much of the public's investment in their cities. There's been a lot of coverage of these issues since the current Black Lives Matter uprising, but African Americans have had technology used against them all the time. Some white people like me are becoming aware of things that they've experienced for a long, long time. Ruha Benjamin calls this the new Jim Code. The employment of new technologies that reflect and reproduce existing inequalities, but that are promoted and perceived as more objective or progressive than the discriminatory systems of a previous era. That's from her book, Race After Technology, which I recommend highly. She's urging us towards abolition. Increasingly, public services are being automated to deprive the poor from benefits more effectively than with human systems. As incarceration goes online, people have to pay to be monitored by tech companies rather than meet with parole officers. And since policing itself is disproportionately devoted to containing a risk that it sees in the very existence of Blackness, the technologies that are shocking to many white protesters are just a daily reality for Black and Latinx people. This is surveillance running in a straight line from slave patrols to artificial intelligence. So Let's move on and talk about another feature of our technological environment. All that data collected to advertise products is used to manipulate people. That's what advertising is. It's also used to influence people's beliefs. White supremacists are really, really good at using these tools to find and groom potential recruits, often providing what appears to be a caring, supportive community for disaffected young men. It offers them social connections and what seems to be affirming life advice as they draw them into the fold. They strategically use a ladder of technological social spaces, starting with obscure ones that are virtually invisible to the average person, where they can test and shape and craft their messages. And then once they've got to where they want them to go, they can start migrating them up through the chain so that they're going through other social media and being pushed into the right-wing media sphere. And then once the president or some other prominent official has adopted those messages, then they end up in the mainstream press. This is a very deliberate strategy to shift the Overton window, to make totally unacceptable ideas seem suddenly up for debate, something that they can, be the other side of in a two-sided argument. There's compelling research about how this works. Jesse Daniels pioneered this idea that white supremacists have embraced the new media, and especially the internet, to amplify and spread their message in her 2006 book, Cyber Racism. And that was a number of years ago she was seeing this happening. And since then, she's documented ways racists have used social channels and internet culture, which spreads ideas through memes, which seem sometimes funny and harmless, and so they offer plausible deniability if they're attacked as racist. Oh, that's just a joke, can't you tell? I mean, look, it's just a silly cartoon. These messages have been embraced by the president, who's pressured social media companies to allow extremist speech by claiming, without any evidence, that Twitter and Facebook censor right-wing viewpoints, which has only encouraged Facebook's tendency to resist taking any responsibility for incendiary hate speech. So in addition to Jesse Daniels' foundational work, there's so much research being done that's really excellent. But I just wanted to highlight a couple more books. Yochai Benkler and colleagues have shown that new technologies built on already highly developed right-wing media spheres. These were starting out in the 1970s with very widespread popular talk radio show stars, and then building on Fox News when that became a thing. What their research shows is that conspiracy theories and extremist positions fail to take root with the left wing because the left wing is still interested in kind of traditional journalistic values of things like facts. And so it's much harder for an out there idea to take root among the left. Right-wing audiences, they've concluded, actually value their having a coherent belief system. Facts are not as important as having things that fit with their belief system, with their sense of self and identity. So while social media audience targeting has amplified this asymmetry between the ways that we perceive the world and what is important to us, the foundations for our present epistemic crisis, it's found in earlier forms of media that followed after deregulation, and they come out of radio and television, and the social media platforms have simply built on and amplified that. And then finally, I want to point out research by Jen Schrader, where she documents why the right is winning the internet. It's not just that a few clever strategists really get Facebook. It's that the left is more fragmented, it's more prone to be critical of itself, and it's less focused on gaining political power as its singular aim. Moreover, despite the amount of press attention devoted to the plight of disappointed white men who are drawn to Trump, poor people on the left are much less likely to have access to technology and to be in contact with well-funded movements. So just a little bit of the research. There's a lot of great research going on out there. So let's see how this is playing out in our current crises. The World Health Organization recognized an infodemic was arising in parallel to the pandemic. soon after the world was alerted to this new coronavirus, this weird conspiracy theory, pieces of it started to surface and spread, tying Bill Gates to the disease. Honestly, I don't know why Bill Gates, but that's a thing. By mid-March, various strands of this rumor coalesced into a single narrative. Bill Gates was planning to microchip us all by planting high-tech spy equipment into vaccines. A YouTube video viewed 2 million times was transmitted to a wider audience when Roger Stone, who has quite an audience, promoted it on a radio show. And then it was reported by the New York Post, which didn't actually take issue with the claim. So this was an example of those things going up the ladder into the public sphere. This news story from the New York Post was liked, shared, or commented on at Facebook by 1 million people, which is more than usually react to a mainstream news article. One study that looked at patterns in the spread of COVID disinformation concluded that a hate multiverse, as they called it, was seizing on the pandemic to associate it with their agendas, blaming it on Jews, George Soros did this, or immigrants, Asians, and the deep state. Though YouTube and Facebook have bent over backwards to avoid being seen as censoring conservatives, they actually did more, at the beginning at least, to curb disinformation about the pandemic than we've seen in other cases. But still, a very carefully orchestrated social media plan pushed a slickly produced conspiracy video out to millions of viewers, sowing doubt about basic medical facts before it could be quarantined. And I just noticed Sunday, a book by the person who stars in that slick video, her book is now on the bestseller list of the New York Times. In the case of the uprising, the administration has decided to blame Antifa, anti-fascists who are not organized in any central way. Anti-fascists, I mean, what are we, pro-fascist? Whatever. They've decided that is the enemy we're going to blame for any violence that's happened. And the president declared Antifa on Twitter a terrorist group, which he has no legal basis for doing, or factual basis for that matter. This developed in parallel with a peculiar panic attack that swept across the internet and into racism enabling apps like Nextdoor and Ring, amplified by police departments, right-wing media, and also the president's son, who amplified it on Twitter. And so suddenly people in small towns across the country were preparing for busloads of anti-fascist terrorists to descend on their little communities to wreak havoc. This all started apparently with a tweet sent by a false account set up by Identity Europa, a white supremacist group. Now, using agent provocateur is, of course, a long-standing strategy by police who routinely infiltrate left-wing groups to sow division and start trouble that can lead to arrests. Well, now it can be done on a global scale, and its origins can be very difficult to trace. As Joan Donovan has shown, the same fake social media accounts that spread COVID-19 disinformation are now spreading the false and inflammatory rumors about the current uprising. And they are quickly rising up that ladder of influence right into the president's Twitter account. So now we've seen how algorithmic systems amplify bias, either starting with biased data, clueless assumptions, or by designing systems that are open to manipulation. So what can we do about this? How do we get out of this mess? Well, first, I'd like to stop and just recognize what's hopeful about this moment. Because we all saw the murder of George Floyd on camera, this horrible, horrible visual of a man being killed before our eyes. That was because a teenage girl had the courage and presence of mind to record those terrible 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And now a large majority of Americans, according to polls, clearly see the connection between racism and our militarized policing practices. It's been building for some time, and now we are seeing something of a tipping point. I worry our attention, so trained by the attention economy to be easily distracted, might slip. But there is a powerful combination of two trends happening right now. One is a greater understanding of how white supremacy operates, and a growing sense of dissatisfaction with the giant tech corporations as instruments for surveillance and the propagation of hate. Those two are coming together, I think. Though the students who we talked to last fall felt powerless to change big tech, just talking about it for half an hour made them eager to learn more and really interested in taking action. Fortunately, a generation of activists, especially young people of color, has honed their organizing skills and they're prepared to lead the change. A good example of citizen activism that's paying off is Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, which is a grassroots community organization in Los Angeles focused on dismantling predictive policing technologies as a harm reduction strategy and as a step toward abolition. This group has spent years researching, exposing, critiquing, and challenging police surveillance technologies such as PredPol, which is a predictive policing algorithm. And they say it so well, I just want to read their words from their website. Predictive policing is rooted in war and occupation. It is yet another tool, another practice built upon the long lineage, including slave patrols, lantern laws, Jim Crow, red squads, war on drugs, war on crime, war on gangs, war on terror. However, this time it's the veneer of science and technology, algorithms and data processing, hotspots and math that gives the stalker state the power, justification, and supposed right to predict, to pathologize, and to criminalize whole communities, and to trace, track, monitor, contain, and murder individuals. This is the trajectory before the bullet hits the body. They've researched these technologies being used by police, and they've won a number of lawsuits. Their most recent victory, the LAPD has finally agreed to stop using PredPol software. This group is adamantly abolitionist, and they're going to keep on working to end the carceral state. Another example, which is closer to home for those of you in New York City, the Public Oversight of Surveillance Technology, or POST Act. This was introduced in 2018. It's been around a while. And it was simply would require the NYPD, the largest police force in the country. It's bigger than the FBI, it's bigger than ICE. It would enable city legislators and the public to know what technology they're using and how it's being used. Of course, the NYPD and the tech corporations who supply it have fought tooth and nail. It's now, though, has enough sponsors on the city council to override a veto. It doesn't seem too much to ask, and yet it's taken years of struggle to get here. Another example of how long-term advocacy work is beginning to pay off, Mariam Kaba, who you might know on Twitter as Prison Culture, has been advocating for prison abolition for years, not reform, abolition. She recently wrote an essay for the New York Times, just came out on Sunday, that talks about police and prison abolition that I think would be really helpful to share with anybody who's just mystified by the concept. This is a scene from Powderhorn Park in Minneapolis. This is where a press conference was held not long ago by members of this Minneapolis City Council. They've adopted a veto-proof resolution to essentially abolish the Minneapolis Police Department. It's going to be harder than that, of course. It's going to take time to work out the details of what will take its place, and the city's residents will have to vote for this movement to make it happen. But would we even be here if it weren't for the long-term groundwork that Mariam Kaba has done? It's wonderful to see this paying off finally. And additionally, we're seeing in the past year or so technology workers resisting the work of building oppressive surveillance systems, of cities beginning to ban facial recognition technologies. And in the past week, some of the companies that have built these systems are saying they'll either stop or they will re-examine the business deals with police departments. And while I'm skeptical, especially of Amazon, it's, I think, at least a measure of how worried they are about public pressure. Basically, this is really hard work. It takes years. It takes finding and lifting up those who know how to do this work. It takes imagination to realize another world is possible. The most effective leaders know history, and they have the imagination to believe things can be different. I think libraries are in a position to help nurture and grow that kind of learning, even as social programs are defunded and educational institutions strip away the humanities. I keep hearing people say, police are having to do too much. That may sound strangely familiar to many of you. They have to deal with homelessness, deal with people with untreated mental illness and crisis, to be social workers. This is going to sound very familiar to librarians since we don't have a functioning political system to address problems like homelessness, addiction, lack of childcare, lack of access to health care, increasing poverty, all of these predictable outcomes of too few people having too much wealth. We like to say, don't worry about it, go to the library. We have the internet, we have Narcan. We're here to help. You know, it's good that we want to step up, but we need to do more to form coalitions to advocate for solutions to these problems, rather than to point to library programs as feel-good public relations. We can't pretend we can fill these gaps. This comes full circle when public library workers reach the limit of their capacities and call the police. We need to support efforts to restore justice and dignity for all, and to have social structures that support that. And library washing these social failures is only a stopgap. It's not a solution. We also need to join efforts to rein in the power of big tech, not just to oppose their oppression through policing and other surveillance algorithms, but also to challenge the ability of a handful of giant monopolies to profit from the amplification of hate without accountability. When so much of the information we use in everyday life is mediated through platforms that have become the most profitable and powerful in the world, by claiming our data to build an architecture of persuasion, that architecture does the work that is the opposite of what libraries do, provide collective access to knowledge for the public good. The fact that libraries still exist and are still beloved by the public is proof that alternatives are possible. We need to actively call for accountability and work with others to imagine socially responsible alternatives. In our own libraries, we need to move from celebrating diversity to practicing, and I mean practicing like over and over and over practicing anti-racism. We have to move beyond merely understanding racism to doing something to reduce its harms. And as part of that work, we need to critically examine our own structures, how our own organizations might strengthen or stifle critical approaches to how we organize our own work. There's a reason we're an 85% white profession. Let's call it what it is, racism. Of course, there are, information needs that fall squarely in our job descriptions, not just book recommendations and libguides. I confess to, comfort creating libguides sometimes myself. Those are fine, but they don't necessarily lead to action. And I just saw this tweet the other day and thought of, kind of makes my point. Oh no, the hyper-militarized American police have become an unaccountable gang of murderous fascists. I wonder if there's some books I can buy to fix this. What could be more helpful? I mean, it is important to help people discover information in books and learn, but what could be more helpful is to be familiar with and be ready to hand links to relevant scholarship out when issues arise. So strategically amplifying what we already know about technologies that have the capacity to discriminate. There's a lot of scholars doing a lot of work on this. Many of them are women and people of color. So they've been working on these issues for years, and they have the receipts. Collect, know, and send these links to reporters, to policymakers, activists, CEOs. I love making library displays. It's great to make library displays that help your community and learn new things, but a lot of these folks never come into the library. So sending one on-target resource could do a lot more good than compiling a 50-tab libguide. I also really like the work that Alison Macrina has done with the Library Freedom Project. It's kind of an example of what libraries can do. Training librarians around the country to help their communities learn about privacy and how to protect it is just a very concrete way that librarians can live out a value that's important to us, not because privacy by itself is a virtue, but because it enables freedom. Leading a privacy workshop is a way of showing your community whose side you're on, while opening up space for something that I think the public is truly concerned about and truly wants to learn more about. As Alison Macrina put it in a recent interview, privacy is important, but what we're really talking about is the newest frontier of exploitation by capital. With all of this work, I'm really trying to force a conversation about who controls the internet and what that means for our lives. The time seems right for our profession to make sure these conversations are happening and to help those who are concerned to connect with the activists and the organizations that are doing something about it. We can't stop now. It will take all of us and all of our strength to grab hold of that arc of history and together bend it ever so slowly toward justice. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing now. Start the video.
Well, thank you so much, Barbara, for that wonderful presentation. And so if folks have questions, please send them on the Q&A and we'll field some.
We will make sure a copy of this is available at the website. So there's some other good presentations there. So
Yeah, there are a few questions that came in about that during your presentation, Barbara. And just to reiterate, this has been recorded. The recording will be posted on the NHTSA website, presumably under the original event listing, as will the slides and Barbara's transcript. So be providing as much information as we have available.
Okay, so let's see. We have the first question is, thank you, Barbara. I was wondering if you could speak to the relationship between visual literacy and algorithms.
that's an awesome question. Wow, you've just blown my mind. That whole role that visual culture is playing in how we identify ourselves and how we spread ideas and how we communicate with each other is just really, really intriguing. So the study of meme culture, I know there are scholars out there doing that and certainly tracking down what are the multiple meanings of the meme. I mean, I was very surprised to see in the Hong Kong protests pictures of Pepe the Frog. What are you doing there? And I still haven't untangled that, but I know there are scholars working on this stuff. But I think that's a really, really interesting question because for a librarian who's been involved in information literacy, I think that component of visual literacy in a meme-based culture opens up a lot of interesting work that we could do that would be of interest to students who are very, very aware of this culture. One thing that Project Information Literacy did before I came aboard last year was a big, massive news study. And one of the things they found is that undergraduate students tend to think of news as a wide range of things, not just newspapers, but all kinds of sources. And political memes were a big part of what they considered news. So I think there's a lot of places to go with that question. That's giving me a lot to think about. I hope people will work on ways that we can make that happen in our own instructional activities. Or maybe it is happening, in which case, hurrah, let's do more of that.
Okay. Thanks. Wow. Okay. From Laura, it says, can you recommend a history of the police that is in the same vein as your opening to this presentation?
I definitely think Ruha Benjamin's book, Race After Technology, is a really good place. I learned a lot from it. I'm sure there are others out there as well, but that's the one that I mostly had my eyes opened by. And I think it's also, I like that book because it doesn't stop at, here's the history, it's terrible, and here we are again. She's really interested in giving people tools for abolition and giving people things they can do. And it's a good read. I mean, it's also really interesting as well. So that's certainly one that I would start with. And I know there are others out there, but that's the one I'm aware of. I see somebody's got Jackie Wang's Carceral Capitalism as a recommendation someone's making.
Okay.
Condemnation of Blackness also.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. Okay, great.
Oh, yes, and The End of Policing. I have read that. Verso Books is making that book available free for download, and it's also a good one. Thanks for reminding me of that. I read that pretty quickly. It's a good book.
So the next question is from Zulai Chang. Are there any countries who are using algorithmic systems in a responsible way? And what does that look like, either in policing or COVID response? It's $1 million question.
Yeah, wow. Boy, I don't know. Right before this, I was looking at Twitter and saw some criticism of how Norway is doing COVID surveillance. So, I mean, I would have thought there might be some Nordic countries or, you know, countries that have this, not in the case of Norway, but EU countries that are more aware of privacy issues that maybe are figuring this out. But I don't know. If others do know, I think that's a really interesting question. I don't know of that being the case. I think nobody really has a regulatory framework yet that is able to rein in what Silicon Valley is doing. And so, yeah, I think, I don't know if there are any models out there at this point. And I think a lot of the fault falls straight on the United States for allowing these companies to prosper using our lack of privacy regulations and exporting it to the world, which makes it very difficult for others to avoid some of this algorithmic bias.
Okay, here's another question. Let's see. From Cindy, looking back at one of your first slides about the magic button for a discovery tool, how do you undo all the hype students have been given that you just plug in a search term, anything you want will just come up to you?
You know, I think we need to stop focusing on search in our instruction with students because search is not the problem. Search is not the issue. I know that and I'm sorry to all the technical services people who are like, wait, I just spend my whole life trying to make this work. I know it's hard work, and making it discoverable is really important, and not frustrating people is important. But I think we make a mistake when so much of what we think of as learning how to do research is learning how to search, when really doing research is much more complex and a whole lot more interesting for students. And I actually felt this way before the internet was invented, because I'm that old. So helping students do things like even tracing citations or grabbing ideas and looking for connections and having growing that sense of empowerment, that this isn't just something you go shopping for and boom, put it in your shopping basket, you're done. I think there are ways to engage students in the harder work of interpretation that is so much more required when you're looking at scholarship and thinking about big issues than doing a simple Google search can be. So that's my thought. Yeah, I think capitalism has done a lot of damage on the shopping front, consumerism. Although a lot of that happened before the internet. Students would go out and look for books and copy chunks, and you know, it's a long-term issue, which really just takes helping them feel empowered and to have the agency to ask questions that matter to them and to engage in those conversations as an equal with others. So.
Okay, ready for more questions if people have them.
Or any panelists too, that would be fun.
I'll go ahead and ask a question. First of all, thanks so much, Barbara. This was a really great talk. Something you mentioned early on was about some conversations you were having with students about their personal data, and you said that all of their solutions were very personalized, but none of them seemed to have a collective solution for how to deal, or even like a notion that such a thing were possible. How do you have any visions for what a sort of collective, a more collective approach to personal data security might look like?
I think what Allison McCreen is doing is a really good start, because people are getting very practical tools, things they can personally do to protect their privacy. But it's also opening the door to thinking about what are the implications of what's going on, and what should we do about it. It's complicated, and I think it's going to take a lot of people agitating for change. It's going to take a lot of legal work, legislative and regulatory solutions. I think it's going to be difficult in our current political system to do any of this work. And yet, I think there's been such a turnaround in the last couple of years, really, I guess, since, I don't know, I mean, Edward Snowden should have scared our pants off, but somehow people kind of let that go, because government does that. But then since the Cambridge Analytica seemed to upset people a lot. I mean, I don't think that company ever could have delivered on the stuff it said it was going to do for a political campaign. I think it was a lot of hype. And yet people were suddenly aware, like, oh my gosh, people are trying to control what I believe and what I do. And they're using this Facebook I used to talk to my cousins. I mean, it really alerted people to stuff they found very disturbing. And then Brexit and the Trump election. And I think people were seeing the consequences of not having their eye on the ball. So I think there is room for a lot of pressure to be put. But, you know, looking at things like Stop LAPD Spying, you know, they've worked really hard and it's taken years, and this is as far as they've gotten. But that's what it is going to take. It's going to take a lot of hard work and a lot of attention, which is hard to keep and hold when there's so much going on in the world and our attention being pulled in all these directions by platforms that want to pull it in different directions. I think, though, just seeing the way students responded to the things we brought up, things they didn't know were going on, that they thought, this is wrong. They really kind of sat up and they got really interested and they wanted to talk more about it. So I think that there's even just opening up that space for kind of informed conversations is going to bring more public pressure to bear on the whole problem of why have we allowed all of this to happen to our privacy, and how can we get our legislators and others to do things like that law that the City Council of New York is trying right now. This small step toward accountability of these tech companies and the NYPD to rein that in. So, by the way, we're keeping, it's too much to read really because we're adding to it every day, but at the projectinfolit.org site, there's a short list of recommended readings that you might find interesting, but then also we're doing an RSS feed and adding to it all the time of new things that relate to this issue. So you can go to the website and pick up on that RSS feed and kind of delve into it as much as you like. There's a lot going on, and a lot of people are noticing. I
love RSS feeds. I feel like I'm in the minority on that, but that's a great resource.
But yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. A whole bunch of questions came in. Okay.
So I provided the link for William if you look in the chat.
Okay.
Type it in here too. But yeah, we have a question here from Eric who said, sort of related, but in the chat, should I put it there? I know there have been a number of articles in newspapers that have tracked the movement of specific instances of disinformation moving from anonymous troll posts on 4chan, 8chan, etc., to Alex Jones, Breitbart, to Fox, to Trump. Is there any website or group that has a comprehensive listing of such instances or that keeps track of these movements in real time?
Wow, that would be awesome. If there is, I'm not aware of it, but Yeah, one of the difficulties with doing this is that it's really hard to get sites like Facebook to cooperate and let you gather that kind of information. Twitter is a little bit more open, and so I know a lot of the research that has been done has really relied on Twitter. That book by Yochai Benkler and two other people whose names I always forget, Network Propaganda, they modeled some ways of looking at issues using kind of trying to scope out what's happening with Facebook, but also using Twitter data. And there's a tool they use, I can't recall the name of it, but it's a free open source tool that you can use, I believe, to do some of this mapping if you want to. But I don't know of anybody who's done it as in that kind of very organized collective, let's catalog all of these instances, or as many as we can of these things. I may be wrong. If anybody else knows of a site, feel free to throw it into the chat, because that's certainly an interesting topic, I think, to watch how these things emerge. There's I'll link to it in the text of this talk. Jesse Daniels has a fairly recent article describing how this happens that I think is worth reading, because it does a good job of not just, you know, showing how it happens now, but going into the history and the actual statements made by major players in the right-wing political sphere saying, here's what we're going to do. And then they map it out exactly, you know, that we're going to shift the Overton window. We're going to make racism acceptable to the American public by doing these things. So they were very, very out front about what they were up to.
Great. Okay, so thank you, Barbara. The next question is from Mia Rosa. What is your take on current legislation like the Earn It Act, which looks to get rid of the end-to-end encryption that is being pushed under the guise of internet safety?
I wish I knew more about it. I'm in favor of end-to-end encryption. I'm in favor of being able to use things like Signal to communicate safely, as safely as possible. I know that, and this may be off the subject because I'm not sure I know exactly what you're asking about, but since the 90s, there have been efforts to give police a backdoor into all of our communications. And they have a backdoor into a lot of our communications, but when things are encrypted, it gets trickier. So even under the Clinton administration, they wanted to put a clipper chip in. There was a big controversy about that to kind of break encryption for law enforcement. And people keep pointing out, that'll break it for everybody. Everybody, you know, all kinds of people will take advantage of that. And it won't be pretty, but they keep wanting to do it because now that they know there's all that information out there and they are used to seizing it, they would love to be able to do it without the hassle of encryption. Sorry if that doesn't answer the question. I may have gone off in a completely different tangent, but that's what I know about it. And I hope we are able to keep encryption because it keeps us all safe. I know bad things happen with encrypted communications. People, you know, but it's kind of like, you know, defending our right to assemble and to speak. Bad stuff happens, but good stuff happens too, and we can't not have it just because it can be dangerous at times.
Great. Okay, so thank you. From Stephanie, what are some micro interventions and tools that we can give to students or patrons so they can take back some of their agency and power, so they don't feel like they have to accept privacy invasions on a website in order to use a website?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting balancing act to help people with this without overwhelming them. The EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, has a website that outlines a lot of stuff that you can do. But it becomes really kind of like, oh my gosh, overwhelming. They do point out, and I think this is something, a place to start is thinking about your threat model. Like, how much risk are you at if information gets out? And then go from there so that people can kind of step up through, you know, embrace some simpler, easy to do, not difficult, things that are going to help with their privacy, rather than going through a giant list of here's all the horrible things that can happen to you and ways to defend yourself that are going to be really difficult, while also being, you know, aware that there are people whose threats are serious. And there's a lot of this right now with the protests going on. I mean, I was just reading about how the police are quite commonly use geofencing, and they're getting warrants to say to people who collect cell phone data, give us information about every person who was in this place at this time. And that's really scary. I mean, that should be outlawed because it is unconstitutional under the Fourth Amendment. But so I think some of it is just sort of saying, here's some things you can do. They won't make your life more difficult. I've done a thing with students where I give them like 10 tips. You know, here are 10 things you can do. Pick one and try it right now. And then, you know, they can decide, kind of look through the pros and cons of these things and adopt what they want to take on. And so I think if you take it that way with kind of like, here's some things that are pretty easy, that's a good place to start, you know. And then on the fringes, you can start mentioning all the ways that their privacy is being invaded and what the outcome, what the potential problems with that can be, which I think a lot of white people are just waking up to now that they're seeing how much surveillance can be done on them when they protest in ways that have been kind of everyday life for a lot of Black and brown people. But I really like Alison Macrina's Library Freedom Project. If you're a librarian and you want to be part of that, sign up. She's got, you know, materials to help you roll this out in your own community. And I think that's a good grassroots way to go.
There's a question here from Alan. Do you see the COINTELPRO of the Nixon era as a direct contributor to the current enthusiasm for police monitoring?
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, if you go back and read the church committee reports, the hearings from the church committee, which convened in Congress to say, look at what's going on with COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence programming from the FBI, the military, a lot of agencies were doing things that were flatly unconstitutional and illegal. And if you read the hearings, it's just like, this could be today. And they're talking about invasions of privacy in terms that sound so familiar. So that, you know, there was after Nixon, there was this sudden reckoning, like, we can't do this. This is wrong. You know, our cities have burned. The president threw away the Constitution and was a jerk. Let's change this. And so, you know, this stuff was exposed and outlawed, and people put on the brakes for a few years. And then things changed, and it's been creeping back. And I think it's going to be hard now, that for two reasons. One is we're so used to surveillance. You know, we've accepted all those agreements that we click through, that I think it's less frightening to people. It was really disturbing to people in the 70s, the technologies involved in particular. So there's that, but then also there's just so much capability, and there's so much data out there for the police to use. So I think actually the best thing to do would be to abolish the police, but you know, and have some public safety programs that work, as opposed to being, you know, looking to the police to be a power to keep us all under control in the name of safety. Safety for who? Well, that's another question. Tall order, sorry. But I do think people are talking about abolish the police and abolish prisons in terms of, I've never heard before. And I think it's, let's work on that.
We have a question here from Craig. Are there higher ed institutions that are doing really good work with algorithmic literacy in a curriculum? And I would second this question, actually. So that was on my mind as well.
Mm-hmm. I know there are some, but I don't know what they are. I can't point you to them. I would go to something like Quora and see what people are up to. Quora is a collection of syllabi and assignment prompts and exercises and things that librarians have put together and shared. There's also an IMLS funded research project out of the University of Montana that's looking at algorithmic literacy, and I think was going to produce some curricula materials for librarians. And I think I may be misrepresenting this, but the last I seem to remember, as they were doing this work, they thought, you know what, we need to back up and educate librarians so that librarians are literate about it before we start doing it with students. So I'm not real sure where it's gone since then, but if you look up IMLS and Montana State University and algorithmic literacy, I think you'll find some materials that they've been working on, and hopefully we'll come out with more materials that we can use. Hi, Craig.
Okay, so Barbara, you're okay with a few more questions, or?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, great. So a couple from Stephanie. Re-upping Mia Rosa's question, tracking activists online. So it has gotten more dangerous to support each other online on Twitter, Facebook, and Snapchat, and they track you that way. Oh, okay, so it's actually one question. So if you are attending a protest, filming it, etc., you are most likely being tracked and monitored, especially as a BIPOC, B-I-P-O-C.
Yes, yeah, definitely. If you carry a phone to a protest, the signals from that, there's very little you can do to prevent information being collected about you. And that's a problem because you might need your phone to film police brutality. So I know some people, advocate for having a burner phone. There's people have written code so that you can actually put on a phone an app where it starts recording and sends a recording of the police to the ACLU or someplace, I forget where. So there are things you can do, but they're kind of extreme because you need a phone. I mean, you need to be able to find out where the kettling is happening. You need to find out all kinds of stuff. So I don't know the answer to this other than that we got to abolish the police. No, that's not helpful. I think to be aware of it is one thing, and then to be ready to deal with what happens next. I don't know what kind of prosecutions are going to come out of this moment of uprising. I think people are like, nah, I'm sorry, I'm not okay with trying to penalize people for expressing themselves as they should. So I'm hoping there will be enough public pressure to make this work. But I would also definitely advocate for just basic safety things like make sure your phone has a passcode on it that, so it's not too easy to get into it, and use things like Signal, which is end-to-end encrypted, has a lot of functionality. Of course, if you don't protect your phone, somebody could pick up your phone and get into your Signal group, and then it's a mess. I know people that's happened to. So do take some basic steps and look for those tools that you can use with some level of awareness. The other thing is, though, that even with something like Signal, police can infiltrate your group and be part of your group and be watching the Signal chats. So, it's not just technology that's putting us at risk, it's the whole apparatus of policing. So I wouldn't give up. I would just kind of look at your options and then say what's most important for me to, and how much risk am I taking on when I go to a protest? I just hope people feel like it's worth it, because the outpouring has been just amazing to see. And I think it's really important that we don't let the power of the police to discourage us from exercising our rights and trying to make things better.
one final question here from Ryan. And I think we might call it a day after this, but if other people have questions, just please send them in. But Ryan wants to ask, Beth Givens and the Privacy Rights Clearinghouse had a nice book out in the late 1990s, the Privacy Rights Handbook. Besides other resources, you already mentioned others in this sort of vein?
Anybody weigh in on that if you like? I know I've seen, know your rights kinds of pamphlets and things that people have. In some ways, I almost feel like you need something that's continually updated, though, because new technologies come or people start using technologies in new ways. And so somebody with a legal background has to evaluate how do we cope with those new capabilities and defend our rights. I don't know of an answer to that. ACLU has some good protest rights. I know there is I think it's the EFF has produced a thing that is about your privacy rights at the border that's helpful. And you can print it out and carry it because, if they take your phone, you're going to have something in writing. So that's another one, because the border actually, the way it's defined legally, includes the majority of Americans' residences, because it's 100 miles in from Mexico, from Canada, from the coast and around the Great Lakes. So virtually most of the big cities in the United States are included in the border, and there are rights for border control to do stuff that is really scary. So having a pamphlet like that and being familiar with it is a good way to know at least some of your rights. That they don't always observe your rights, but it's good to know that actually that cop just broke the law. And so you're not unsure about it. And it looks like some suggestions are coming in, so maybe we can compile some of those too. That would be great.
Yes, I'll also share, save the chat and send that out in a mailing to all of the registrants. So.
Yeah, I'd love to see some of these resources people are suggesting. That's great.
Well, Barbara, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. I learned a lot.
Thanks for inviting me. And I know there's a lot people know, and I can see that from the chat. So it's good to pool some of that knowledge this way. So thanks for inviting me, and thanks for putting this on. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Barbara. This was fantastic. And thanks for everybody for attending and for your great commentary and questions. We hope to do more events like this, and it'll probably be on an online format for the foreseeable future. But
yeah,
there's still good things we can talk about and, constructive conversations we can have. So.
Okay, thanks a lot.
And the great thing is we can have participants from all over the world listen to.
Yeah, that was cool to see.
Yeah. All right, thank you, Barbara.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Barbara.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.